The library steps were quiet that morning, the way they always were before the city truly woke up. A soft breeze rustled the tall trees lining the sidewalk, scattering a few golden leaves across the worn stone steps. Commuters passed by with coffee cups in hand. A librarian unlocked the doors. Everything moved with the calm rhythm of an ordinary day. And at the top of those steps sat a dog. No one knew exactly when he started coming. He was a large golden dog, with gentle eyes and a coat that caught the early sunlight like warm honey. Every morning he appeared at the same place, sitting perfectly still, facing the street, watching. At first people assumed he belonged to someone nearby. Maybe a student. Maybe a regular visitor. But the strange thing was this. The dog never moved. Not for food. Not for strangers calling him. Not even when the librarian, Mrs. Carter, tried to coax him closer with a soft voice and a bowl of water. He would glance at her politely, then return his gaze to the road. Waiting. Days turned into weeks. Then one chilly morning, as Mrs. Carter climbed the steps with her keys in hand, the dog suddenly stood up. His ears shot forward. His body stiffened. And instead of calmly watching the road like always, he began whining softly, pacing, and pulling toward the corner of the street. Something had changed. Mrs. Carter felt a strange knot tighten in her chest as she followed his gaze. Because the dog wasn't just watching anymore. He was recognizing someone. But what the dog sensed was far from ordinary. Before we continue, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more heart-touching dog stories. And tell me, where are you watching from? The library opened every morning at 8. Not a minute earlier. Not a minute later. Mrs. Eleanor Carter had followed that routine for nearly 20 years. She liked routines. They made the world feel dependable. Steady, predictable. Every morning she walked the same path from the parking lot to the front steps, a small ring of keys chiming softly in her hand. The air usually smelled of damp leaves and old paper drifting from the ventilation vents. And most mornings were quiet. Just a few early commuters. A cyclist passing by. Maybe a student waiting for the doors to open. But on a cool autumn morning in late October, something was different. Mrs. Carter noticed it immediately. A dog sat on the top step of the library entrance. He was large, golden-coated, calm, too calm. The dog wasn't wandering. He wasn't sniffing the ground or exploring the bushes like most strays would. He was simply sitting, perfectly still, facing the street. Mrs. Carter slowed her steps. The dog's ears twitched slightly when he heard the jingle of her keys. But he didn't turn his head. He kept watching the road, waiting. She stopped a few feet away, studying him carefully. His coat looked clean. Not freshly groomed but healthy. His posture was relaxed yet alert. Front paws placed neatly together. Tail resting quietly beside him. Not afraid. Not aggressive. Just present. Mrs. Carter tilted her head slightly. "Well now," she murmured softly. "Where did you come from?" The dog glanced at her for a brief moment. Warm brown eyes. Gentle. Curious. Then just as calmly he looked back toward the street again. As if her question didn't matter. As if something else mattered much more. Mrs. Carter waited a moment. Then she climbed the remaining steps. The dog didn't move. Not even an inch. He simply allowed her to pass. The keys slid into the heavy brass lock. Click. The library door opened with its usual low creak. Inside, the familiar scent of books wrapped around her like an old blanket. She turned on the front lights. Then paused. Something tugged at her curiosity. Mrs. Carter stepped back outside. The dog was still there. Same position. Same quiet focus on the street. She folded her arms. "You waiting for someone?" The dog's ear flicked. But again he didn't turn. A car drove past. A bus rumbled at the intersection. Leaves scraped gently along the pavement. And the dog continued to watch. Mrs. Carter let out a small breath. "Well," she said kindly, "you're welcome to sit there as long as you behave." The dog didn't react. But somehow she felt as if he understood. By mid-morning the library had filled with its usual quiet rhythm. Students typing on laptops. Parents guiding small children toward the reading corner. Pages turning. Soft footsteps between shelves. Mrs. Carter had nearly forgotten about the dog. Until she noticed a small group gathered near the window. Is that dog still out there? Someone whispered. She walked over and glanced through the glass. The dog hadn't moved. Same step. Same direction. Same watchful gaze toward the street. A young college student leaned closer to the window. Has he been there all morning? Mrs. Carter nodded slowly. Yes, he has. Another visitor frowned. Maybe he's lost. Maybe, Mrs. Carter replied. But something about the dog didn't feel lost. Lost dogs wander. They search. They pace. They sniff. This one did none of those things. He simply waited. Around noon, Mrs. Carter filled a metal bowl with water and stepped outside. The autumn air had warmed slightly. The dog noticed her this time. His ears lifted. She set the bowl down a few feet away. There you go, she said gently. The dog looked at the bowl, then at her, then slowly stood. His movements were graceful, careful, quiet. For a moment Mrs. Carter thought he might walk away. But instead he stepped forward, lowered his head, and drank. Soft lapping sounds echoed against the stone steps. Mrs. Carter smiled. Well, that's better. When he finished drinking, the dog lifted his head and looked at her again. Up close, his eyes were even warmer. Older, perhaps. Not a puppy. Not young. But strong. Steady. He wagged his tail once. Just once. Then he turned, walked 2 steps back, and sat down again. Facing the street. Exactly where he had been before. Mrs. Carter blinked. You're determined, aren't you? The dog didn't answer. He simply resumed watching the road. The afternoon passed. Visitors came and went. Clouds drifted slowly across the sky. And the dog remained. Sometimes his ears would twitch when footsteps approached. Sometimes his head tilted slightly when a voice echoed from the sidewalk. But he never left the step. Never followed anyone. Never wandered away. He watched. Quietly. Patiently. Waiting. At 5 o'clock the library began to close. Mrs. Carter stepped outside again as she locked the doors. The air had grown cooler. The streetlights flickered to life. She glanced toward the step. The dog was still there. But now he stood, stretching his legs slowly. For the first time all day, he looked away from the street. He glanced at the library doors, then back at the road. And finally he began to walk down the steps. Mrs. Carter watched him carefully. He didn't run. Didn't hurry. He simply walked toward the corner, calm and steady. At the edge of the sidewalk he paused, looked back once, then disappeared down the street. Mrs. Carter stood there for a moment. The evening wind rustled through the trees. She shook her head softly. Well, that was unusual. The next morning he was back. Same step. Same position. Same watchful gaze toward the road. Mrs. Carter stopped halfway up the stairs. Her eyebrows slowly lifted. Well, I'll be. The dog glanced at her, tail wagging once. Then he returned his attention to the street. Mrs. Carter studied him for a long moment. Something about this wasn't random. It wasn't wandering. It wasn't coincidence. This dog wasn't just passing time. He was waiting. And somehow, he seemed absolutely certain that one day, someone would come walking down that road. Mrs. Carter exhaled slowly. All right then, she said softly. Let's see who you're waiting for. The dog didn't move, but his ears lifted slightly, as if he understood the question even if he couldn't answer it. And the quiet mystery of the library steps had only just begun. The next morning arrived with pale gray clouds hanging low over the town. A quiet drizzle tapped gently against the library windows. Mrs. Eleanor Carter stepped out of her car, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. The air smelled like wet pavement and fallen leaves. She climbed the path toward the front steps. And before she even reached the doors, she already knew he would be there. The golden dog sat exactly where he had the day before. Same step. Same posture. Facing the street. Rain dotted his fur, but he didn't seem to mind. Mrs. Carter stopped halfway up the stairs. Well, she sighed softly, you're certainly consistent. The dog's ears twitched. Slowly, he turned his head toward her. For a moment their eyes met. Warm brown eyes. Calm, patient, almost thoughtful. His tail gave one slow wag against the stone step. Then, just like yesterday, he turned back toward the street. Watching. Mrs. Carter shook her head gently. You know, she said, climbing the rest of the steps. Most dogs would at least try to come inside. The dog didn't react. He simply sat waiting. By mid-morning, word had begun to spread. Visitors paused at the library window more often now. A child pressed his hands against the glass. Mom, look. The dog's still there. A young mother leaned down beside him. Oh wow, he is. Inside, Mrs. Carter stood behind the front desk, organizing returned books. She could hear the whispers, curious voices, soft conversations, people wondering the same thing she had been wondering since yesterday. Why was the dog here? And who was he waiting for? Around 10 o'clock, Mrs. Carter stepped outside again. This time she carried two things, a metal water bowl and a small container of dog biscuits. The dog noticed immediately. His ears lifted, but he didn't stand. Mrs. Carter set the bowl down first. Then she placed two biscuits beside it. There you go, she said gently. Breakfast. For a moment the dog didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the street. Cars passed. A cyclist rode by. Rain pattered softly against the sidewalk. Then finally he stood. Slowly, carefully, he walked over to the bowl, drank, then sniffed the biscuits. Mrs. Carter watched with quiet interest. Go on, she encouraged softly. The dog picked one biscuit up delicately. Crunch. Then another. When he finished, he looked up at her again. This time his tail wagged twice. A little stronger. A little warmer. Well, that's progress, Mrs. Carter said with a smile. She crouched slightly, extending her hand. Come here, boy. The dog stepped forward. One step. Two. His nose brushed gently against her fingers. Warm breath. Soft whiskers. Mrs. Carter chuckled quietly. Friendly, too. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might stay beside her. But then, his ears suddenly perked. He turned sharply. Eyes locked onto the street again. His body stiffened slightly. Mrs. Carter followed his gaze. A man walked down the sidewalk carrying a briefcase. The dog watched him closely. Hopeful. Alert. Tail lifted slightly. The man passed the library. Without stopping. Without noticing the dog's tail slowly lowered. He turned away, walked calmly back to the same step, and sat down again, facing the road. Mrs. Carter watched him carefully. Something about that moment felt different. That wasn't random curiosity. That had been hope. Real hope. She crossed her arms thoughtfully. You really are waiting for someone, aren't you? The dog didn't respond, but the quiet determination in his posture said enough. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every morning, the dog arrived before the library opened, always sitting in the same place, always watching the street. Visitors began greeting him. Morning, buddy. A teenager brought him a piece of toast one day. An elderly man offered a gentle pat on the head. The dog accepted kindness politely, but never followed anyone, never wandered away. Every interaction ended the same way. He returned to the step, sat down, and watched the road. Mrs. Carter started bringing him fresh water each day, sometimes a small bowl of food. The dog accepted both with quiet gratitude, but his focus never changed. Waiting, watching, hoping. One afternoon, as sunlight finally broke through the clouds, Mrs. Carter sat beside him on the step. She rarely had time to do that, but something about the dog's quiet patience had begun to settle in her thoughts. She leaned back slightly. The warm stone beneath her still held the heat of the afternoon sun. You know, she said softly, this library has seen a lot of people come and go. The dog glanced at her briefly, then returned to watching the street. Students grow up here, she continued. Kids learn to read here. She smiled faintly. Some people even meet their best friends here. The dog's ears twitched. A car turned the corner. He leaned forward slightly, watching. But again, no one stopped. Mrs. Carter studied him. You must really believe they're coming back. The dog slowly exhaled through his nose. Quiet huff. His tail brushed lightly against the step, and for a moment he rested his chin on his paws, still watching the street, still waiting. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the sidewalk grew quieter. The afternoon rush faded. Shadows stretched across the library steps. Mrs. Carter locked the front doors just before 5. She turned to look at the dog. He was standing again, stretching his legs slowly. "Heading home?" she asked gently. The dog walked down the steps, but halfway to the sidewalk, he stopped. His ears lifted suddenly. His body froze. Mrs. Carter frowned. "What is it?" The dog stared down the street, completely still, listening, watching. His tail lifted slightly. A quiet whine escaped his throat. Mrs. Carter followed his gaze. But the street looked ordinary. Cars, streetlights, pedestrians. Nothing unusual. After a long moment, the dog relaxed again. The tension melted from his body. He turned and walked calmly toward the corner, just like the night before. Mrs. Carter stood alone on the steps. A strange feeling lingered in her chest. The dog hadn't been reacting randomly. He had sensed something familiar, something important. But whatever it was, it hadn't arrived yet. Mrs. Carter looked down the quiet street, then back at the empty step where the dog had been sitting all day. And for the first time, she wondered how long this quiet vigil had already been happening. Because one thing was becoming clear. This dog wasn't simply passing time. He was waiting with a patience that only comes from deep loyalty. And sooner or later, something was going to change. By the following week, the golden dog had become part of the library. Not officially. No paperwork. No collar tag anyone could read. But in the quiet, unspoken rhythm of the place, he belonged there. Every morning, he was already sitting on the top step when Mrs. Carter arrived. Every evening, he disappeared just before the library closed. And in between, he watched the street. Always the street. The townspeople had started noticing. People slowed their pace when walking past the building. Some smiled. Some whispered. Some simply stood for a moment, studying the patient animal on the steps. A few even began greeting him. "Morning there, buddy." The dog would lift his head politely. His tail might wag once or twice. But his eyes always drifted back to the road, as if something there mattered far more than any passing stranger. One crisp Tuesday morning, the sky was bright and clear. Sunlight spilled across the library steps in long golden lines. Mrs. Carter climbed the walkway with her usual calm pace. Sure enough, there he was. Same step. Same quiet focus. "Good morning," she said gently. The dog glanced at her. His ears flicked forward in recognition. Then he looked back toward the street. Mrs. Carter chuckled softly. "You're very committed to this job, aren't you?" She unlocked the doors and stepped inside. But before she closed the entrance behind her, she turned back. The dog hadn't moved. Not even slightly. Still watching. Still waiting. Inside the library, the morning routine unfolded as usual. Computers hummed. Books slid across the checkout counter. Children whispered excitedly in the reading corner. But every so often, someone would walk to the window and peek outside. Is the dog still there? The answer was always the same. Yes. Always. Around midday, Mrs. Carter carried out a bowl of water and a small portion of dog food. The dog rose as she approached. His tail wagged gently. "Lunchtime," she said kindly. He walked over and ate quietly. No rushing. No guarding. Just calm, steady bites. When he finished, he looked at her again. For a moment, Mrs. Carter wondered if he might follow her inside. But instead, he turned, walked back, and sat in the exact same spot as before, facing the street. Mrs. Carter sighed with a small smile. "Of course you did." Over the next few days, she began paying closer attention. Not just to the dog, but to his patterns. He wasn't just sitting randomly. There were moments when his ears would suddenly perk. Moments when he leaned forward slightly. Moments when his tail lifted just a little. Every time someone approached the library from down the street. And every time, his body relaxed again when the person passed by. The disappointment was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A quiet lowering of the head. A slow exhale. Then back to waiting. Mrs. Carter noticed it more and more. This wasn't a stray dog looking for food. This was a dog searching for someone. One afternoon, a young delivery driver stopped near the steps. He crouched beside the dog. "Well, hey there," he said warmly. The dog allowed him to scratch behind his ears. His tail wagged. Friendly. Relaxed. But after a moment, the dog gently stepped away, turning his attention back toward the road. The driver looked puzzled. Not interested in hanging out, huh? Mrs. Carter watched from the doorway. He's waiting, she explained softly. The driver glanced up. For who? Mrs. Carter shook her head slightly. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Later that day, the wind picked up. Leaves tumbled across the sidewalk. The sky slowly darkened with gathering clouds. Still the dog remained on the step. Watching. Always watching. Mrs. Carter stood beside him for a moment. You must have a lot of patience, she murmured. The dog blinked slowly. His ears twitched. Then suddenly, he stood. Fast. Much faster than usual. Mrs. Carter straightened. What is it? The dog's posture changed completely. His body leaned forward. Muscles tensed beneath his golden coat. His ears stood tall. Eyes locked down the street. A faint sound escaped his throat. Not a bark. Not a growl. A soft, hopeful whine. Mrs. Carter followed his gaze. A figure appeared in the distance, walking slowly along the sidewalk. The dog's tail lifted. His paws shifted. He took one step forward. Then another. The whine grew slightly louder. Hope. Clear and bright. Mrs. Carter felt her heart lift too. Maybe this was it. Maybe the mystery was finally about to be solved. The person approached closer. Closer. And then, they crossed the street, turning the opposite direction. The dog froze. The hopeful tension slowly faded from his body. His tail lowered. His ears relaxed. And after a quiet moment, he walked back to the step, sat down, and returned his gaze to the road. Mrs. Carter felt a small ache in her chest. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered. The dog didn't look at her, but his breathing slowed again. Steady, patient, waiting. That evening, as the sun sank low behind the buildings, the sidewalk grew quiet again. Mrs. Carter locked the library doors. She stood beside the dog for a moment. You had me fooled today, she said gently. The dog stretched his front legs, then his back. A slow, tired motion. But instead of leaving right away like usual, he hesitated. His ears lifted again. This time something felt different. He wasn't just listening. He was sensing something. A distant sound perhaps. Or a scent carried on the evening breeze. His nose lifted slightly into the air. His body stiffened. Mrs. Carter watched him carefully. What do you hear? The dog stepped down one stair. Then another. But instead of walking away, he stopped halfway down the steps. His gaze locked onto the far end of the street. Still. Focused. Intense. Another soft whine escaped him. Mrs. Carter felt the same strange tension from the day before. Something had caught his attention again. Something important. But the street looked ordinary. Cars passed. People walked. Nothing unusual. After a long moment, the dog relaxed again. Slowly. Quietly. He finished walking down the steps. Then disappeared around the corner. Just like every other evening. Mrs. Carter remained on the top stair, watching the empty sidewalk. Thinking. Something was building. She could feel it. The dog's instincts were changing. His reactions were getting stronger. More certain. As if whatever he was waiting for was getting closer. And somewhere deep inside her, Mrs. Carter had a quiet feeling that the dog's long wait might soon come to an end. But when that moment arrived, it would change everything. The next few days passed with the same quiet rhythm. Morning light across the library steps. The soft sound of turning pages inside. And the golden dog sitting in his familiar place. Watching. Waiting. But something had begun to change. Mrs. Eleanor Carter could feel it. Not in the town. Not in the library. In the dog. His movements were becoming sharper, more attentive. Every sound made his ears lift a little faster. Every approaching figure held his gaze a little longer. As if his instincts were slowly tightening towards something he could almost sense, but not quite reach. One quiet afternoon, Mrs. Carter stood near the front window with a mug of tea warming her hands. Outside, the dog sat exactly where he always did. Sunlight rested softly across his back. A few yellow leaves drifted across the steps. Inside the library, a teenage volunteer named Lucas sorted returned books into neat piles. Lucas had been helping at the library for almost a year. Quiet kid. Polite. Observant. He walked over and followed Mrs. Carter's gaze through the window. "The dog's still here," he said. Mrs. Carter nodded. "Every day." Lucas studied the dog carefully. "He doesn't look lost." "No," she replied softly. "He looks like he's waiting." Lucas leaned a little closer to the glass. "Has anyone claimed him?" Mrs. Carter shook her head. "No collar tags we can read. No missing posters either." Lucas frowned slightly. "That's strange." Outside, the dog lifted his head suddenly. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the library. His ears stood tall. Body alert. He watched the truck carefully as it passed. Then, just as always, the tension faded. He settled back down again. Lucas noticed. "He keeps doing that," the boy said quietly. "Watching people." Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes, and hoping." Lucas tilted his head. "Hoping." Mrs. Carter took a slow sip of tea. "I think he's looking for someone." That evening, just before closing time, Mrs. Carter stepped outside again with the dog's water bowl. The sky was painted with soft orange clouds. The street was quiet. The dog stood as she approached. His tail wagged once. "Hello again," she said gently. She set the bowl down. He drank slowly. When he finished, he sat beside her instead of returning to his usual step. That alone caught her attention. "Well," she said softly, "that's new." The dog didn't look at her. His nose lifted slightly into the breeze, as if testing the air. Then he turned his head, looking toward the library doors. Mrs. Carter followed his gaze. "You want to go inside?" His ears flicked. Not excitement. Not curiosity. Something else. Recognition. Mrs. Carter frowned slightly. "You've been inside before, haven't you?" The dog remained quiet, but the way his eyes rested on the doorway felt strangely familiar. Not like a stranger studying a new place, like someone remembering an old one. Later that night, after the library closed, Mrs. Carter sat alone at her desk reviewing old circulation records. The quiet building hummed softly around her. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the empty steps. Her mind kept drifting back to the dog, the way he watched the street, the way he studied the doorway, the quiet certainty in his patience. And slowly, a small memory stirred somewhere deep in her thoughts. Not clear yet, just a faint feeling, like hearing a song you almost recognize. Mrs. Carter leaned back in her chair. "Where have I seen you before?" she murmured. She closed her eyes for a moment. And then, a picture flickered in her mind. A boy, a younger boy, sitting at one of the library tables near the window, always reading, always quiet, and beside him, a golden dog. Mrs. Carter's eyes opened. Her heart gave a small, surprised beat. That can't be. She stood slowly, walking toward the large window that overlooked the front steps. Of course the steps were empty now. The dog had already left for the evening. But the image in her mind kept growing clearer. A boy with messy dark hair, maybe 10 or 11 years old, coming to the library almost every afternoon. Always polite, always quiet, and always with the same golden dog lying beside his chair. Mrs. Carter whispered softly to herself, "I remember now." The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen. Soft light touched the tops of the buildings. And there he was, the dog, already sitting on the step. Mrs. Carter climbed the stairs slowly. Her eyes studied him carefully now. The shape of his ears, the color of his coat, the calm, steady posture. The pieces were starting to fit together. She crouched slightly in front of him. "You used to come here," she said softly. The dog looked at her, his eyes warm, attentive. Mrs. Carter felt a quiet certainty growing inside her. "There was a boy," she continued. "You came with him." The dog's ears lifted. His tail moved once against the stone. Mrs. Carter felt a small chill run through her. "You're waiting for him, aren't you?" The dog turned his head toward the street again. Watching. Waiting. But this time, Mrs. Carter saw something she hadn't noticed before. Not just patience. Not just loyalty. Memory. This dog remembers something important. Something tied to this place. To these steps. To this street. Mrs. Carter slowly stood again. Her heart beating a little faster now, as if her memory was correct. Then somewhere out there was a boy who had once shared this quiet routine. A boy who used to sit inside the library with a book open in front of him, while this loyal dog waited faithfully beside him. But now the dog was here alone, waiting, still believing the boy would come back. Mrs. Carter looked down the empty street. A strange warmth filled her chest, because if that boy ever did return, this dog would know instantly. And judging by the growing tension in his instincts, that moment might not be far away. Inside the library, Lucas looked up from his stack of books. "Morning, Mrs. Carter." She walked in slowly, still thinking. "Lucas," she said thoughtfully. "Yes. Do you remember a boy who used to come here a lot? Maybe a year ago?" Lucas frowned slightly. "Maybe. What did he look like?" Mrs. Carter glanced out the window again, at the golden dog sitting patiently on the steps. "Messy dark hair," she said slowly. "Quiet. Always reading." Lucas blinked. Then his expression changed. "Oh wait." Mrs. Carter turned toward him. "You remember?" Lucas nodded slowly. "Yeah." He pointed toward the dog outside. He had a dog just like that. Mrs. Carter's breath caught softly. The pieces had fallen into place. But the real question still remained. If the boy had stopped coming, then why was the dog still here? Still waiting. Still watching the street every single day. And somewhere deep inside her, Mrs. Carter felt the quiet certainty that the answer to that mystery was getting closer. Much closer. The morning air carried a quiet chill. Autumn had begun settling deeper into the town now. The trees lining the street outside the library had turned shades of gold and amber. Every small breeze sent a few more leaves drifting across the sidewalk. Mrs. Eleanor Carter stood behind the front desk, organizing returned books into careful stacks. But her attention kept drifting toward the window, toward the steps, toward the golden dog. He was there just as he had been every day, sitting calmly on the top step, watching the street, waiting. But today felt different. Mrs. Carter couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way the dog's posture seemed more alert than usual, or the way his ears kept lifting, lowering, lifting again, as if every distant sound mattered, as if something inside him was growing more certain. Lucas noticed it too. He stood beside the window, quietly observing the dog. "He looks restless today," the boy said. Mrs. Carter walked over. Outside, the dog shifted slightly on the step, not pacing, but not completely still either. His eyes scanned the street more often now. A car passed. His ears lifted, then relaxed again. A cyclist rode by. The dog leaned forward slightly, then settled back. Mrs. Carter folded her arms thoughtfully. "He's expecting something," she said softly. Lucas nodded. "But how does he know when to look?" Mrs. Carter didn't answer, because she didn't know. All she knew was that the dog's quiet patience had lasted for weeks, and today something in the air felt closer. Around noon the sky brightened. Sunlight spilled across the library steps. The street became busier as lunchtime crowds moved through town. Mrs. Carter stepped outside with the dog's usual bowl of water. He stood immediately when he saw her. His tail wagged once. "Hello again," she said gently. She placed the bowl down. The dog drank. But today he didn't take his time. 2 quick laps of water. Then his head lifted. Ears forward. Eyes locked down the street. Mrs. Carter noticed instantly. "What is it?" The dog stepped forward. 1 step. Then another. His nose lifted slightly into the breeze. His body had grown completely still. Listening. Watching. Waiting. Mrs. Carter followed his gaze. At first she saw nothing unusual. Just the familiar street. A few parked cars. People walking along the sidewalk. But then, far down the road, a figure appeared. Someone walking slowly. Lucas had stepped outside behind her now. "Who's that?" he asked quietly. The dog's tail lifted. Not wagging yet. Just raised. Hopeful. The figure drew closer. A teenager. Thin. wearing a worn backpack, head slightly lowered as he walked. The dog took another step forward. His breathing quickened. Mrs. Carter felt her heart begin to beat faster. Is that? Lucas squinted down the street. I think that's him. The teenager continued walking. Slowly, almost cautiously, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. Then, the dog let out a small sound. A soft, trembling whine. The kind of sound that comes from deep recognition. His tail began to move. Slowly, then faster. Mrs. Carter's breath caught. The boy was closer now. Close enough to see his face. Messy dark hair. Tired eyes. Lucas whispered beside her. That's him. I remember now. The dog couldn't hold back anymore. He bounded down the steps. Not wildly, but with sudden unstoppable excitement. His paws tapped quickly against the pavement. His tail wagged in wide circles. The boy looked up. At first, confusion crossed his face. Then his eyes widened. He stopped walking, completely still. The dog slowed as he reached him. His ears tilted forward, his body trembling with anticipation. The boy whispered softly, "Buddy." The dog's entire body exploded into motion, tail whipping happily, paws bouncing. A joyful bark burst from his chest. Just one. Clear. Bright. The boy dropped his backpack. And the next moment, he was kneeling on the sidewalk. The dog pressed against him, nuzzling his face, licking his hands, whining happily. The boy wrapped both arms around the golden neck, holding him tightly. His shoulders shook. Mrs. Carter and Lucas watched from the steps. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. Weeks of waiting. Days of silent patience. Every hopeful glance down the road. Every quiet moment on those stone steps. It had all led to this. The boy pressed his forehead gently against the dog's head. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. The dog whined softly in response. His tail never stopped moving. Mrs. Carter slowly walked down the steps. Lucas followed behind her. When they reached the sidewalk, the boy looked up. His eyes were red, but he was smiling. Mrs. Carter spoke gently. "You must be Daniel." The boy blinked. "Yes, ma'am." Lucas grinned. "I remember you. You used to read here all the time." Daniel nodded. The dog rested his head against the boy's shoulder, still wagging softly. Mrs. Carter looked down at him. "So his name is Buddy?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah." Mrs. Carter glanced back at the library steps. "That dog has been waiting for you here every day." Daniel's eyes widened. "Every day." Lucas nodded. "For weeks." Daniel looked down at Buddy, his hand resting gently on the dog's back. "You came back here." Buddy gazed up at him, ears relaxed, eyes warm, tail still moving slowly. Mrs. Carter felt a gentle warmth spread through her chest. All this time, the dog had never been lost. He had simply returned to the place that mattered most, the place where he believed his boy would come back. And today, his patience had finally been rewarded. But as the three of them stood quietly on the sidewalk, Mrs. Carter sensed that the story behind their separation had only just begun to unfold. For a long moment no one spoke. The sidewalk outside the library felt unusually quiet, even though the town continued moving around them. Cars passed. Leaves rustled along the pavement. Some pedestrians slowed down, smiling at the sight of the boy hugging the golden dog. But Daniel barely noticed any of it. He was still kneeling, both arms wrapped around Buddy, his fingers buried gently in the dog's warm fur. Buddy pressed close against him, tail swaying slowly behind him like a steady rhythm of happiness. Every few seconds he lifted his head, licking Daniel's chin, nudging his shoulder, as if making absolutely sure this moment was real. Daniel laughed softly through his breath. "I can't believe you're here." Buddy let out a quiet, happy whine. Mrs. Carter stood beside them, her hands folded loosely. She gave them a few extra seconds. Reunions like this needed time. They needed space to breathe. Finally, Daniel slowly stood. Buddy stayed close to his side immediately, almost glued to his leg. Mrs. Carter smiled gently. "You must have missed him very much." Daniel nodded. His voice was soft. "I thought he was gone." Lucas shifted beside her. What happened? The boy asked. Daniel hesitated. His fingers rested lightly on Buddy's head, stroking behind his ears. Buddy leaned into the touch with a calm, satisfied sigh. For a moment Daniel looked down the street, gathering his thoughts. Then he spoke. A few months ago we had to move. Mrs. Carter listened carefully. My mom lost her job, Daniel continued quietly. We couldn't keep the apartment anymore. Buddy's ears flicked as he heard Daniel's voice, but he stayed relaxed beside him. We had to pack everything really fast. My uncle came to help us move to another town. Daniel swallowed gently. There was a lot going on that day, boxes everywhere. People coming in and out. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly. I remember you stopped coming to the library around that time. Daniel looked surprised. You remember? Mrs. Carter smiled softly. You were one of our most dedicated readers. Daniel looked down at the sidewalk for a moment. Then he continued. When we were loading the truck, Buddy got scared by something. His hand tightened slightly in the dog's fur. A loud crash. I think one of the boxes fell. Buddy shifted closer, pressing lightly against Daniel's leg. He ran out the door before we could stop him. Lucas frowned. You couldn't find him? Daniel shook his head. We searched everywhere. His voice lowered. For hours. Mrs. Carter felt a quiet ache in her chest. But we had to leave that night, Daniel said. My uncle had already driven down to help, and the new place was hours away. Daniel paused. Buddy looked up at him, watching his face carefully. I didn't want to go, Daniel admitted. I kept hoping Buddy would come back before we left. His voice softened. But he didn't. Mrs. Carter gently asked. Did you ever come back to look for him? Daniel nodded slowly. Once. He looked toward the library steps. Last week. Lucas blinked. Last week. Daniel nodded. We finally had enough money for my mom to take a day off from work. He scratched Buddy's neck gently. I thought maybe, just maybe he might come here. Mrs. Carter exchanged a glance with Lucas, because that explained something. The dog had started appearing on the steps about a week earlier. Daniel continued. I walked past the library but I didn't see him. Mrs. Carter spoke quietly. You must have just missed him. Daniel looked surprised. Missed him? He leaves around sunset, she explained. Daniel exhaled slowly. So he really was coming here. Buddy wagged his tail softly as Daniel spoke. Mrs. Carter looked down at the golden dog. He's been waiting here every day. Daniel's eyes widened again. For how long? Lucas answered. At least a couple weeks. Daniel's hand rested gently on Buddy's head again. You came back to the library. Buddy looked up at him with calm eyes. As if the answer was obvious. This was their place. Their routine. Their shared memory. Mrs. Carter leaned slightly on the railing of the steps. Dogs remember patterns, she said softly. Places that matter. Daniel nodded quietly. We used to come here almost every day after school. Buddy's tail tapped lightly against Daniel's leg. We'd sit by the window, Daniel continued. I'd read, and he'd sleep beside the table. Lucas smiled. I remember that. Daniel chuckled faintly. He loved this place. Mrs. Carter looked at Buddy again. And he believed you would come back here. Daniel's throat tightened slightly. His fingers stroked the dog's fur again. I guess. He knew me better than I thought. Buddy leaned his head against Daniel's chest. A calm, peaceful gesture. No excitement now. No tension. Just quiet contentment. Mrs. Carter felt the moment settle warmly around them. The waiting was over. The long days on the library steps. The endless watching of the street. The quiet patience. Buddy had never given up. Not once. And somehow his faith had been right. Daniel looked toward the library doors. Can we go inside? Mrs. Carter smiled warmly. I think that would be perfect. Lucas stepped aside and opened the door. Daniel picked up his backpack. Buddy walked beside him. Close. Steady. As they stepped into the familiar smell of books and warm light, Buddy paused for just a moment. He looked around slowly. His ears relaxed. His tail wagged gently. Recognition filled the room. The place he had remembered all along. And as Daniel sat down again at the reading table near the window, Buddy curled quietly at his feet, exactly where he used to be, as if no time had passed at all. The library felt different that afternoon. Not louder, not busier, just warmer. Daniel sat at the familiar table near the tall front window, the same place he had used to sit months ago. Sunlight streamed softly through the glass, painting long rectangles of light across the wooden floor. And at Daniel's feet, Buddy rested quietly, curled in a loose circle. His golden fur rose and fell with slow, peaceful breaths. Every now and then, his tail brushed gently against the floor. Not out of excitement, just contentment. Daniel opened a book from the stack Lucas had placed on the table. He hadn't even chosen it yet. Lucas had simply remembered the kind Daniel liked. Adventure stories. Explorers. Distant places. Daniel smiled faintly. "Thanks," he said. Lucas shrugged. "You used to read those all the time." Daniel ran his fingers along the book's cover. "It feels weird being back." Mrs. Carter sat behind the front desk, pretending to organize paperwork while quietly listening to their conversation. Buddy lifted his head slightly when Daniel spoke. His ears twitched. Then he rested his chin back on his paws again, completely relaxed. Lucas pulled out a chair across from Daniel. "So where are you living now?" Daniel hesitated. "About 2 hours away." Lucas nodded slowly. "That's far." "Yeah." Daniel glanced down at Buddy. "We're staying with my uncle right now." Buddy looked up again when Daniel said the word we. His tail thumped softly. Lucas leaned back in his chair. "Are you staying there permanently?" Daniel shrugged. "I'm not sure yet." His voice softened. "My mom's trying to find work closer to here again." Mrs. Carter looked up at that. "Closer to this town?" Daniel nodded. "She said if things work out, we might move back." Buddy's ears lifted at the change in Daniel's tone. He slowly stood up, stretching his front legs. Then he rested his head gently against Daniel's knee. Daniel scratched behind his ears. "I think he'd like that." Lucas smiled. "Yeah, he seems pretty attached to this place." Buddy's tail wagged slowly. Throughout the afternoon, visitors continued coming in and out of the library. But something about the atmosphere had shifted. People noticed. They paused near the window, whispered to each other. Some recognized the dog immediately. "Is that the one who's been sitting outside every day?" Mrs. Carter would simply smile. "Yes." And then she would add softly, "He was waiting for his boy." Daniel heard one woman say that as she walked past the table. His cheeks flushed slightly, but his hand instinctively rested on Buddy's back. Buddy leaned gently into the touch. The bond between them had always been quiet, never dramatic, just steady, constant. Later that afternoon, the sunlight began fading into soft evening tones. Daniel closed his book slowly. "I should probably get going soon," he said. Buddy lifted his head immediately. His ears perked. Lucas frowned. "You're leaving already?" Daniel nodded. "My mom's picking me up at the bus stop down the street." Buddy stood up fully now, his tail wagging gently. Mrs. Carter walked over from the front desk. "Well," she said kindly, "I hope this won't be the last time we see you." Daniel looked around the room. The tall bookshelves, the reading tables, the quiet corners he remembered so well. Then he looked down at Buddy. "I think we'll be back." Buddy wagged his tail a little faster. Lucas grinned. "Good." Daniel slung his backpack over one shoulder. Buddy followed him closely toward the door. Every step matched. Side by side, Mrs. Carter walked them out onto the steps. The evening air had cooled again. Street lights were beginning to flicker on. Daniel paused halfway down the steps. He knelt beside Buddy again, his hands resting gently on the dog's shoulders. "Listen, boy," he said softly. Buddy tilted his head, ears forward. "I have to go home tonight." Buddy watched him carefully. Daniel's voice stayed calm. "But I'll come back." Buddy's tail wagged slowly, as if he understood. Daniel hugged him one more time. Then he stood. Mrs. Carter noticed something touching in that moment. Buddy didn't panic. He didn't try to stop Daniel. He simply watched him, trusting, believing. Because this time things were different. Daniel walked down the sidewalk toward the bus stop. Buddy stood at the top of the library steps, watching, just like before. But this time, the waiting didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. Daniel turned once near the corner. "Bye, Buddy." Buddy's tail wagged. Daniel smiled, then continued walking. Mrs. Carter stood beside the dog. "Well," she said softly, "you were right all along." Buddy sat down again on the top step. But now his posture was different. Relaxed. Content. He wasn't searching anymore. He was simply watching. Mrs. Carter rested a gentle hand on his head. "You knew he'd come back." Buddy gazed down the street. The same street he had watched for weeks. But now there was no tension. No anxious waiting. Just quiet certainty. Because some bonds, once formed, never truly break. Morning returned to the town with a quiet glow of early sunlight. Soft gold spilled across the rooftops. The streets were calm, the air cool and fresh with the scent of autumn leaves. Mrs. Eleanor Carter walked up the familiar path toward the library steps, her keys jingling softly in her hand. For a moment, she paused at the bottom of the stairs. Not because she expected something unusual, but because the past few weeks had changed the meaning of this small, simple place. The top step of the library had once been just another piece of stone. Now it held a story. A quiet one. A patient one. A story about loyalty. Mrs. Carter climbed the steps slowly, and there he was. Buddy sat in his usual spot. But everything about him felt lighter now. His posture relaxed. His tail resting comfortably beside him. When he saw Mrs. Carter approaching, he stood and wagged his tail warmly. "Well, good morning," she said with a smile. Buddy stepped forward and gently nudged her hand with his nose. She scratched behind his ears. "You seem happier these days." Buddy's tail wagged again. The street beyond the library was still quiet. But Buddy wasn't staring at it the way he used to. He looked toward it occasionally, then back toward the library doors. As if he knew that waiting no longer had to fill the whole day. Mrs. Carter unlocked the doors. "Come on in." Buddy walked beside her. Inside, the library felt peaceful as always. Morning sunlight slipped between the tall bookshelves. The scent of paper and polished wood filled the air. Buddy padded across the floor calmly, his paws making soft sounds against the wood. Without hesitation, he walked to the reading table near the window. The same table. The one Daniel used to sit at. Buddy circled once, then lay down. Mrs. Carter watched him with a gentle smile. "You've claimed your spot again." A few minutes later, Lucas arrived. He stepped through the front door and spotted Buddy immediately. "Well, look at that," he laughed. "He's already inside today." Buddy lifted his head and wagged his tail in greeting. Lucas walked over and crouched beside him. "Waiting for Daniel again?" Buddy tilted his head slightly, his ears flicking forward. Mrs. Carter chuckled softly. "I think he knows Daniel will come back." Lucas nodded. "Yeah, I think so too." The morning passed peacefully. Visitors came and went. Some recognized Buddy immediately. A woman pointed gently toward him. "That's the dog who waited outside every day." Her young daughter smiled. "He found his boy, right?" Mrs. Carter nodded warmly. "Yes, he did." Buddy rested quietly beside the table, occasionally lifting his head when the door opened. Not anxious, just curious. Every time someone entered, his ears twitched. But he remained calm, content. Around mid-afternoon, the front door opened again. Lucas glanced up from the desk. Then his face lit up. "Mrs. Carter." She looked up from her paperwork. Standing in the doorway was Daniel. And beside him, a woman with kind, tired eyes. Daniel's mother. Daniel stepped inside slowly. Buddy's head lifted immediately. For a brief second, the room felt completely still. Then Buddy stood. His tail began wagging, slowly at first, then faster. Daniel laughed. "Hey boy." Buddy trotted across the room and pressed happily against him. Not wild excitement, just joyful recognition. The warm kind that comes from knowing someone belongs in your life. Daniel knelt down. Buddy licked his cheek once and rested his head against his shoulder. Daniel's mother smiled softly as she watched. "So this is the famous library dog." Mrs. Carter approached them. "We prefer to think of him as part of the library family." Daniel stood again. We came to tell you something. Mrs. Carter raised her eyebrows. Oh. Daniel's mother stepped forward. I found a job here in town, she said gently. Daniel grinned. We're moving back. Lucas clapped his hands. That's awesome. Buddy wagged his tail enthusiastically, sensing the happiness in their voices. Mrs. Carter felt a warm feeling spread through her chest. Well, she said softly, I suppose Buddy won't have to guard the steps anymore. Daniel laughed. He probably still will. Buddy glanced briefly toward the front door, then back at Daniel. His tail continued wagging. Later that evening, the sun dipped low across the town. Long shadows stretched across the library steps. Daniel sat at the familiar table with a book open in front of him. Buddy rested beside his chair again, exactly where he used to be. Mrs. Carter stood near the window, watching the peaceful scene. Lucas leaned beside her. He looks happy. Mrs. Carter nodded. He always believed this day would come. Outside, the quiet street glowed under soft evening light. The same street Buddy had watched for weeks. The same road where he had waited with endless patience. But now the waiting was over. Daniel closed his book and leaned down, resting his hand gently on Buddy's back. Buddy sighed contentedly, eyes half closed. Calm. Safe. Home. Mrs. Carter whispered quietly to Lucas. Dogs teach us things sometimes. Lucas looked at her. Like what? She watched Daniel and Buddy for another moment. Like how loyalty works. Buddy's tail moved slowly against the floor. A soft rhythm of trust. 'Cause sometimes, love waits patiently. Sometimes it sits quietly on a set of library steps, watching the road, believing that the person it cares about will come back. And sometimes, that belief is enough to bring them home again. The library lights glowed warmly as evening settled over the town. And at the reading table near the window, a boy read his book. A loyal dog slept beside him. And the bond between them, tested by distance, strengthened by patience, remained as unbreakable as ever.